without further ado, I'll share my screen. Okay, fantastic. So what is it that we need to know when we're looking at our disclosures around our risk management? The first thing is, very similar to the rest of your AASB, it's really, really important to remember who we're doing this for, what we're looking to disclose, and of course, how this all comes apart, right? It comes together, sorry. The risk management pillar, which can be a little bit confusing because in your assurance in year one, it's actually risk sits within strategy, which is a bit strange, even though, of course, strategy and risk are different pillars. But you're required to identify, assess, prioritize, and monitor your climate-related risks. Okay. Now, there will be a huge amount of work, or hopefully not a huge amount of work, but there will be a very considerable amount of work that goes behind what you often will see in any of the businesses who have already disclosed. I'm sure you've all read through a few of your favorites of the Group 1 companies who reported on the calendar year. Their risk section is often quite small, right? It may be a table or a few paragraphs. Behind that, though, is the process that they would have gone through to identify, assess, and prioritize. And then, of course, hopefully with good management, good systems, good processes internally, they will then now also have metrics in place that they can monitor over time to see how those climate risks are influencing the business. Okay. The big thing here is we're looking at how we are strengthening the resilience of the business when it comes to any of these climate related events. Okay. Now, the big focus here is making sure that everyone who needs to be able to can make the right decisions internally to correctly mitigate and build resilience against these risks that have been identified. Okay. We're not saying that absolutely everything that you identify needs to be acted on, but what we are saying is you need to be able to prove how you have pulled together all of this information, which stakeholders internally you've engaged to do so, and then how you have gone through the process of what I think of like distillation, how you have taken the bulk of your overall everything that happens in the business across all of your functional units, across all of your physical sites, across all of your supply chains, across all of your regulatory considerations, market changes, customer expectations, and then how you refine that down into a distilled, concise, clear grouping of prioritized risks and opportunities over your scenarios, so your periods of time that you've picked. Okay, so your end outcome will be a clear high, medium, and low on your short, medium, and long terms for each of the different physical and transitional risks that you've picked. Now, jumping into that, really what good looks like is making sure that things are very specific, making sure that you actually have data to back these things up, making sure that you've got references to past events, things that have actually happened and how they influence the business. A great example, and sorry, I will use a lot of the easy examples, but a great example is, say, the Black Friday fires, right? If your business operates in Victoria, you can look at how those horrible events impacted your business's operations, right? You may have an office in Melbourne CBD that really wasn't impacted in the scheme of things because your staff could still work, your majority of your business is actually spread around the rest of Australia, for example, or the rest of the world. And in the scheme of things, it represented a fraction of a percent or a couple of a percent of your overall trading. And that trading wasn't actually influenced or impacted because you're a legal practice and, you know, the smoke and fire was not of concern for you, or it was concern for you, but was not directly impacting your ability to work because you were sitting inside your well air-conditioned, filtered office, right? However, if your business is a manufacturing organization with a key manufacturing site in, say, in Melbourne or regional Victoria, and you had to either shut down because of direct risk associated with the fires themselves or with the broader health and safety issues to do with the smoke in the air and obvious issues that causes for your workers, then of course that becomes a much more material risk. And what we want to see, what we think a good, strong disclosure looks like, is you actually being able to prove that with data, right? So proving things like how many of your employees were affected. Of course, you'll have your employee numbers. We want to see, which of your employees are in that particular region or in that particular site. What sort of runs of production were affected. Any links to, your financial assessments and the dollar values associated. The way we always approach going from a weak disclosure to a strong disclosure is, first off, get everything down on paper, get everything down on page, get it into your framework, right? And this will always best come out using the workshops that workshops that can guide your team through sort of the extraction of this information. Again, all of this subject matter expertise about your business is usually in the heads and the minds of your key team members. So bringing everyone together, extracting information, no wrong answers sort of environment, making it really clear what information we're trying to tap into. Once you have that big list, there will tend to be relatively weak disclosures. And we move them into a strong disclosure by starting to move from that qualitative information into much more detailed quantifiable information, like customer numbers, revenue numbers, employee numbers, maybe usage numbers, depending on your business, this sort of stuff. And then that helps us go to, having things that are more quantified, like say $3 million of asset impairment risk, and away from things that are just generic statements. In this, what is very, very important to avoid, and I think coming back to the first point about who and what and who this is for, is you don't want things to be generic, and you don't want things to not be linked to your financials. You don't want things to not be well connected to the specific aspects of your business where this influences. And so you want to make sure that you're checking off that you've got very clear scoping and boundary around where this risk occurs, and then also very, very clear measurable impact metrics of how this risk or opportunity, influences the business. So I'll stop here and just check if there's any questions. I can see the chat. There's nothing in the chat right now, but I welcome you to sort of pop any questions you'd like into the chat about anything I've just said. If there's nothing, though, I'll keep going along. But please do feel free to ask questions. I really want to, make sure that everyone's coming along with what's being said. And if you've got a question, there's a very good chance someone else in the room has that same question as well. So please don't be shy. Okay, fantastic. So moving forward and assuming that there are no questions from, how we make sure we have good disclosures versus weak disclosures and what those disclosures actually need to start looking like, I'll jump into the definitions and the breakdowns of our types of risk. Now, for those of you who mentioned that you're quite experienced and that you've gone through this process yourself, this will all be very familiar. For those of you who are a bit newer to looking at your climate-related risks and opportunities, this will be a little bit more novel for you. But basically, we break our climate-related risks into physical and transitional risks. Okay, your physical risks, are exactly what they sound like they are. Okay, they're where you have sites, facilities, supply chains, actual tangible climate events that occur where something like a bushfire or a flood or increased humidity or storms or what else? Or a heat wave is a very, very common risk for businesses where they tangibly impact your business's ability to operate, trade, your staff's ability to work, and they need to be mitigated as such. Okay. The second type of risks that we look at are your transitional risks. These are things that are more so driven by your external stakeholders and are still extremely important to the business. Things like your policies that change, literally why we are all here right now. Okay. The Australian mandatory reporting is a good example of transitional risks for businesses who fall into groups 1, 2, or 3, and also is a transitional risk for, say, a small business or a medium-sized business who now has more pressure to report up to their big client. Okay, that's a good example of a transitional risk. There are also things like disruptions, technology, and also general sort of market expectations shifts. The ever increasing expectations around green consuming is also a good example of a transitional risk, right? If your customer group is less motivated to purchase off you or will no longer purchase off you if they don't deem that you meet their expectations from a sustainability and ESG perspective, that is also a transitional risk for you as well. Okay. And so just a couple of examples here to help everyone sort of completely wrap their head around things, and remembering that within each of your physical and transitional group buckets, if we call them that, there are different types, again, of those risks. So your physical risks, you have acute and then you have chronic. So you can see here, your acute sudden events, like a flood, right? It happens, it hits hard, and it's often over a short period of time. Your chronic are more long-term changes, like increased unbearable working heat days across summer. Okay. And of course we plan and mitigate for those slightly differently. In your transitional risks, good example that we've got here is new regulations for the agricultural industry around their emissions, right? And those growing expectations from the market, such as Woolworths and Coles, for primary producers to be able to report to them to a higher standard. Okay. Now, breaking these down, you can see that whether it's policy and legal, whether it's reputational, whether it's chronic risk, depending on your business, they may rank really any way. I don't want anyone to think that just because it's a physical risk, it's higher than a transitional risk, right? We have lots of companies who we've helped through their risk identification and distillation process, as I've said before, where it ends up that actually they deem a lot of their physical risks to be either minor or medium, but they see that some of their transitional risks are extremely high, are really critical. Okay. So this will be very case by case, depending on the business that you're looking at. One thing that's always important to come back to here, in my opinion, is the frequency and severity. And I told you, you'd probably get a little bit sick of hearing me say that today, but it really does come down to, when you look at each of these risks, the first thing that I think you should be thinking about is, how often does this happen? And when it does happen, how bad is it? Right? Now, for a lot of these examples, you will often have some form of precedence or some form of historical event to look back on. And that is my second very clear recommendation whenever you're thinking about any of these physical or transitional risks. Think, has anything like this happened before? And when it did happen, if it has happened, how bad was it? And how many times has it happened as well? Okay. Really good example to sort of contextualize that for you. Let's say you're a construction business, and let's say heat is an undeniable physical risk for you. And in fact, you're a construction business that operates all over Australia, and in particular, extreme heat days, which we'll say are over 40 degrees or over 38 degrees, are far more prevalent, right? Far more likely happening in Queensland, Western Australia, and northern New South Wales. I know that they do happen everywhere, but we'll just say that the likelihood, and this is when we start to look at the sort of broader data, the likelihood is higher that, of course, they're happening more regularly up there. As a result, you then need to look historically, let's say at last summer, how many days over summer, how many working days over summer were the temperatures over 40 degrees, 38 degrees, right? And in those cases when they were over 38 degrees, how much did that impact our business? How much did that impact our ability to deliver our jobs on time? How much did that impact our ability to complete jobs like, say, concrete pours? Because, of course, the heat can affect how the concrete sets, right? Do we have any mitigation and risk strategies already in place that mean we are able to maybe start work earlier in the morning? Or do we have, any policies and procedures that enable us from a contracting perspective when we're in our bidding process to say to the client, hey, look, if we're going to be working between December to March or even a little bit broader, we need to budget in some days for heat days that we expect to occur because, we've obviously looked at the area that this work's going to commence. We've looked at, say, the last 5 years of weather data, and we can see that there's a 25% likely chance that over 50% of the days are affected by heat in some way, right? And so that's the process that really you should and will go through with every single risk you look at. And you'll also look at it on your selected scenarios as well. So if your business has picked two scenarios, let's say 2 degrees and 4 degrees, you may have picked 3 scenarios. You simply will just build that into the matrix, again, that we'll share after this, which you can sort of model out and map out the impact of all of your chosen risks in each of the different scenarios and timelines you have as well. Okay. Now, as a bit of a refresher, and I know that most people here will be very familiar with what our climate scenarios are. This is taken directly from Ventia's reporting. Ventia's done a very good job in their reporting. You can see here we've got sort of fast action for the 1.5 degree. We've got delayed action for the 2 degree, and then the required action and the insufficient action for the sort of worst case scenarios as we get north of 2 and 3 degrees. Okay. Now you can see that the severity and the frequency start to increase as you go further up those scenarios, of course. And this is what you want to be modeling out your resilience against as well, to really inform key stakeholders like your investors, how you are going to manage these changes as they become more severe and more common. The way we'll start the process, and coming back to that whole idea of refinement and distillation, is first thing is you'll pull together the right people from the organization. That'll often look like regional managers. That'll look like your financial management, your operations and facilities management. Of course, all of yourselves who are here who are representing the sustainability teams. Often also you'll have, some senior leadership, executive, sponsor type people there. So could be your CFO, your COO, your CEO. And then from this working group, you'll start the process off by scoping and identifying, as we've got highlighted here. And really what that is about is first, of course, making sure that everyone in that working group has the same level of base understanding that you all, now are developing or already have about what these risks are and why they can impact the business and why they matter and why creating resilient strategies for them are important in this ever-changing, evolving world. And then it's about really letting those people talk to their own experiences and share their opinions on how frequent and how severe these events are when they occur, or in the transitional side of things, how frequent and severe they are when maybe a client asks for the information and they don't have it, right? So this is the part where we're basically just looking to extract all the information from the people you've got in your organization. You may have, the person who's been working for 30 years looking after a particular building, knows that building back to front, inside out, has a bunch of information in their head that has never really been documented anywhere. this is a great opportunity to pull some of that information and share some of that information out just from the individuals and into the broader context and understanding of your leadership group and your ESG committee. Okay, I will take some questions there, if any. I'll just unshare my screen so I can look at the chat a bit better. Does anyone have any questions about what I've said so far? I know that I'm talking a lot, so I'd appreciate a question just so that I can see a bit of a gauge of what has and what has not been taken in. Okay, thank you, Aparna. I appreciate it. Could you touch upon transition risks a bit? Sure thing. So, and I'll sort of refresh and go back to the slide and share my screen on that. And apologies for anyone who's if I didn't explain it very well. And Aparna, thank you for the add-on to the question and how scenarios impact these risks. So could I touch upon transition risks a bit and how scenarios impact on these risks? 100%. So where's my share screen gone? All right, fantastic. Okay, so we'll stay just focused, laser focused here on the transitional risks and also look at how the scenarios impact this. So I'll start with this, how scenarios impact our risks as a starting point, okay? First things first, with your scenarios, of course, with a more severe or dire scenario, right, in a higher degree warming, we are going to see more impacts from climate change than we currently do, okay? That's undeniably agreed. 97% of all global scientists and studies and sort of agree on that point, and that's the basis of our science-based targets. And so in these scenarios where the warming goes up, where you've got a higher scenario, we know that our impacts from climate are going to be more damaging. And as such, from a transitional perspective, it is reasonable to forecast, expect, and plan for that each of your different stakeholders here or groupings within your transitional risks, so your policy and legal, markets, technology, and reputation, will all be acting more accordingly. Okay, and now what I mean by that is if we see more and more impacts of, I'll just stay with heat just for the sake of it. If we see more and more impacts of extreme heat because of consistent global warming, it's fair to expect that from a market perspective, your customers and clients will see this as a bigger issue because it will be affecting them more, not only in their business, but in their day-to-day lives. And so they will care more about your alignment with their climate ambitions and leadership. Okay. I think everyone can agree on that. Same goes if we see more devastating impact from climate events. It's fair to assume that from a legislative perspective, government and other policymakers will only increase the scrutiny and requirements on their laws and policies that they set. Okay, so that's how answering the second part of your question, that's how I'd answer that. On the transitional risks, it's really about thinking everything external to your physical operations. That's the way I look at it. Okay. Now, this can be that you need to, change suppliers even because some of your suppliers don't align with your own climate goals or your clients' climate goals, and as such, they themselves can be a key supplier with poor sustainability credentials, could be a key risk in your supply chain, and as such, a key risk to your business. A good example of this, and I'm looking at precedents again, is modern slavery. Okay, you of course would not work with businesses who fail your modern slavery assessment. Okay. This is very similar to the way I would be treating that in your supply chain analysis, supply chain engagement. Other examples, obviously policy and legal is very easy. You know, if there's a specific change that not just thinking about mandatory reporting, but a specific change that comes into your industry, how that affects your business. Are you set up to respond to it? Do you have the right resourcing internally? Do you have the right systems in place? Or is this going to be a huge cost and time drain that you're not going to be able to bear? And then lastly, I'll just look at the reputational piece, right? What is the impact to your business if you are not seen as a good corporate citizen that's doing what needs to be done, in the eyes of whoever your consumer is? Okay, so they're your transitional risks: changing perspectives, changing laws, changing technology, changing market expectations. That's what your transitional risks are. I hope that answers your question. And just jumping back out of share so I can see the chat. Zoe's asked, will there be another session covering climate opportunities? No, but I'm just about to jump into climate opportunities. So good, very good question there, Zoe. And then another question very quickly from Martin. What would be the smallest risk other than, say, flood you have used? Smallest risk. See, flood's very big for some, right? For primary producers, floods are big. For like football stadiums, floods can be really big because they stop people getting to the events. I would say a very interesting one would be like you could call it small, but it's maybe big to the company. Humidity is one that comes up, Martin. Like humidity obviously doesn't affect many businesses, but it really does affect the construction space because it completely throws out how concrete sets. And so that's like a good example of maybe a small one that broader society would be less concerned with. I also think that small is interesting, right? Because if you look at, say, the wildfires. Actually, I'll give you a real example with NetNada, right? So NetNada's got clients all over the world, but mostly are in Australia, right? Now, the wildfires that happened in California a couple of years ago, okay, we have clients in California, right? But a very small percentage of our clients are in California. So when the fires occurred in California, while it impacted some of the people who use our software and some of the people who we engage with, in the overall mapping of our business, it was a very, very small percentage. Okay. And so I think that's sort of the most interesting part I think about once you get into that later, the timeline sort of graph I showed you before, we're originally in the scoping and prioritization, scoping side of things. As you go through the prioritization, you get to that point where you actually start to look at customer numbers and user numbers and revenue and whatever else. And so that's where sometimes really big events can be seen as small, to answer your question, Martin, in the context of whatever business you're looking from. So I hope that answers your question. And one more question I'll take is from Abby. How useful is scenario planning for mitigation and adaptation? I'll give you a very short answer. I wouldn't just say it's useful. I'd say it's a necessary, because you want to be able to test your risks and opportunities over the different scenarios, right? So it really is the basis of what your resilience looks like over the different scenarios and of course time periods. But I hope that helps everyone who had questions, and to those who didn't have questions, I hope some of those questions were helpful and relevant to you. Okay, so conscious of time, and I'll keep going. Thank you very much for the questions, team. We'll jump into our next piece, which is our risk prioritization and integration. Okay, now there's a very, very good chance that you already have a enterprise risk management framework as an organization, right? Now, this will be things like, of course, looking at what are some classic risks like safety to your business, looking at things like legal disputes, looking at things like shifts in the market, looking at tariffs, trade, whatever it may be, right? You'll very likely have some form of risk matrix mapped out. If you don't already have something like this mapped out, I highly recommend that you do map this out with your climate risk identification, risk and opportunity identification. The reason for that is it really helps contextualize things and it helps put things on the same page. For those of you who know me well personally, you'll know that I sort of kind of always say apples to apples comparisons, especially when we're looking at the metrics and targets and emissions calculations. This is a very similar thing. You want that apples to apples comparison of how you're looking at any risk within the business, right? As well as your climate related risks. And you want to make sure that they are prioritized on the same way that you prioritize your other risks. Okay. A good example is $1 million to NetNada and to us is a lot, right? So if something's got $1 million risk associated with it, right, when we do the financial quantification, that's a big deal. And we're going to, do whatever we can to adjust and prioritize. $1 million to your organization might be nothing, right? In fact, $10 million to your organization might not be that much, right? So it's really important to start with quantifying everything together and then going through from that process of how you're going to prioritize and integrate and map this all in with your other with your broader risk matrix. Now, going back to the Ventia example, as you can see here, and again, I'll share these slides, but you can actually dive in and see how they map it out, how they use the same terminology, the same definitions. You want everything all to read and sing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak, okay? In that process, right, in your risk management, you'll be looking at what you need to do to first look at processing those risks, aligning those risks, and then also processing those opportunities and looking at what the implementation and change process will be to take advantage of those opportunities as well. Okay. Now, I haven't spoken a whole lot about opportunities just yet, but I will come to that shortly, as I mentioned. But the thing I'll just flag before I jump into that is that it's really important that you as a team sit down after you've matrixed everything and mapped everything out, after you've aligned everything with your other broader organizational risk management framework, that you then document and generate the correct policies to support this information, okay? Not only for the fact that it will be used as supporting information for your disclosures and it will be something that your auditors will likely ask for, it's also to the point that there really is no point of doing this if it isn't something that you can make sure you're monitoring, as we've spoken about at the beginning, right? And that you're keeping on top of and you're measuring against and you're seeing how your resilient strategies sort of stand up to the pressure of whatever those risks are. So once you've gone through this whole process, make sure to actually map it out, understand what the inputs and parameters are around those policies, what information and data sources you need to have on hand, what good measurement of these different scenarios and events looks like, so that you can easily report internally and understand if you're doing a good job or not such a good job, okay? When we're looking at our overall scenario analysis, you'll be looking at really, as things change, how your processes and policies and mitigation strategies stack up, okay? It's important to note that a plan that you have in place for the current scenario, the resourcing you have in place, the resilience strategies that you have in place don't necessarily stand up in, say, your 4-degree scenario. Okay, so one really important thing I would just note and tell you to sort of make a point on is don't assume that any existing resilience strategy you have in place is enough for any of those future scenarios. And also always make sure to interrogate and sort of stress test how those resilient strategies perform over time and over your different scenarios as well. Okay, so conscious of time, I will jump into our opportunities because this bit here goes for a little bit long. But what I wanted to do before I go into the opportunities is just check if there's any other questions there, which I can see there is one. Actually, no, there's not. Yes, there is. Sorry, trying to manage the chat and the slides. I am sure you have reviewed many responses. How prevalent was AI in helping to develop these responses? That's a good question, Annette. I think I can't speak for the ones we've reviewed because we haven't done all of them, but I can speak for in our own process and how we use AI to identify in our clients or partners risks and opportunities. Number one thing I would say is from a desktop analysis perspective, when we're looking at geospatial data, we're looking at all of their physical locations, we're mapping through their supply chains and where their different key suppliers operate from and the impacts of weather events in particular. AI is incredibly helpful. Like I think we sort of had the benefit, and I was sort of joking with one of our younger team members earlier in the week, where I sort of said to him, I was like, you haven't really worked without AI, like you don't really know what life was like before AI. Knowing what it looked like doing this before AI, it was a much, much longer, more difficult process, like even just mapping out all of the locations and understanding weather patterns in those scenarios would take you weeks and months. So I think first and foremost, your desktop analysis is just a million times more efficient. Secondly, I would say it's so much easier now, and everyone here can do this with Claude, to just go and look at what other companies are doing. Okay, so if I'm just picking a random business here, like if you're KFC, because KFC, we don't work with KFC, so it's an easy one to pick. If you're KFC, you can easily go and look at what McDonald's has been doing, right? And Hungry Jack's and Red Rooster and everyone else who's even slightly similar to you. So I think AI has been really, really helpful in that sort of comparisons and seeing from competitors what they've disclosed as risks, if any. And then lastly, I would say, like, I've spoken a lot about the whole idea of getting everyone in a room and extracting that information from them. Let's say you've got a workshop where you've got 15 people in a room. Of course, back in the day, you could have had a junior person there, scribing everything out and typing it all together. But now having note takers and recorders and having the meeting notes on just changes things completely. So I would say that would be the last thing. It sort of, pulls everything together for you as well. Okay, so with that in mind, and I hope that was helpful, I'll jump into opportunities very quickly because I know that was, something that was being asked of. The way we map out opportunities is exactly the same as the way that we map out risks. Okay, we still look at opportunities from a physical and a transitional perspective. Okay, obviously there will be it can be very hard for your business to find opportunities out of the physical impacts of climate change. It's undeniable. Often a lot of the opportunities will come out of new product lines or new business models or new service delivery lines, or from a transitional perspective, how you can get ahead of, say, your competitors or better support your clients and look better in the eyes and be better in the eyes of your key stakeholders. It does also come down to things like, are there areas where you see you can mitigate and be resilient in a more efficient way as well? So to answer the question before about the opportunities piece, I really want you to think of it in the same way. I really want you to still pull your key team together, right? Get insights from the sales team, get insights from the support, customer success, delivery, whatever you call them in your business, that team, and go through that process of no answer is a bad answer. Get it all down on page for the physical opportunities, if you have any, for the transitional opportunities in each of the different subsets within both, and then sorry, and then go through that process of distilling and refining. One really interesting thing about the opportunities piece, which I'll leave you with on this, is you want to make sure that you can financially quantify the benefit of theoretically addressing whatever that opportunity market is. Okay. So I'll try and say that in sort of plain language rather than corporate jargon. If you've got, say, an opportunity that you identify as saying, we're going to be able to sell this new trinket or this new service, or we're going to be able to provide a slightly modified offering of whatever we already do to the market. Let's say, I'll use a real example. Let's say you're an accounting firm and you turn over $50 million a year, and you've gone, you know what, I think we can do some carbon accounting. It seems like an area that's heating up. There's companies like NetNada, which we can do it way better than. And so you start up your arm of the accounting business, which is carbon accounting. Okay. Now, it will come back to that whole process of materiality and looking at, okay, if you're making $50 million a year already from just normal tax financial accounting, well then what is an amount of money that justifies the resources, the effort, the risk of setting up this new vertical? And you might say, you know what, for us, we think it's 20% of total revenue. Okay, so we're going to say that we're going to make $10 million a year out of this carbon accounting vertical now that we're going to create. Okay. And so that's the process that we suggest for people to go through with their opportunities, to really focus on, yes, the total addressable market and the impact it will have on your customers and satisfaction and all of that stuff. But also get to the point of being able to financially quantify what that opportunity is. Because if in this scenario, it's not a $10 million opportunity, it's a $300,000 opportunity, well, then you may be better off just spending your time focusing on that $50 million business and turning that $50 million business into a $55 million business, right? So I hope that answers your question. I hope that gives everyone sort of a broader perspective of how we tie the way we look at risks and opportunities together into the same physical and transitional frameworks. And on that point, conscious that we've only got a few minutes left, I will sort of close today. But I do welcome any questions that anyone has. Please feel free to put more in the chat. And yeah, thanks so much. If you've got to run, thanks so much for joining as well.